Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the library. Happy Saturday. Everyone feeling okay today? Very good. We're here. We're getting a nice musical distraction from the world around us, which is much needed. My name is Nicholas Brown Casares. I'm the Assistant Chief of the library's Music Division. Very pleased to welcome you all here today on behalf of our Chief, Susan Vita, who is doing some cool things out in Los Angeles. So she will be waving from afar this afternoon. Today's pre-concert lecture is a special lecture, part of our Lewis C. Elson Memorial Fund lecture series in the Library of Congress. So it's a bit of an extra special occasion for us to pair this lecture with the Francesco Corti harpsichord recital. The afternoon's concert is presented in association with the Italian Cultural Institute, and we always extend our gratitude to them. They've been wonderful partners for many decades. In 1945, the Library of Congress received a bequest from the late Mrs. Bertha L. Elson, who was the widow of Louis Charles Elson. This bequest intended to provide support for lectures on music and musical literature and to foster public interest in music and musical literature in memory of her late husband. As author, teacher, speaker, composer, and editor, he had a career of great significance in America's musical development. Over the decades, we have presented many different types of scholarly lectures here at the library, both with scholars who are visiting from outside, from all over the world, as well as our own curators here at the library who are wonderful experts in many different subject areas. Some might ask why we do this. It's very important that the library, as the repository of the living memory of our cultural heritage, be a convener and a platform for the people who are doing the work in discovering new things about the past to help inform the present. And certainly Professor Wolf has been one of those phenomenally accomplished scholars who has had a relationship with the library and our collections for many years. So we're very pleased to have him at the library today for the Elson lecture. And just a bit of a kind of who's who of previous lecturers. They've included folks like Jacques Barzin, a cultural historian, Tim Page, former critic for the Washington Post, Gustav Reese, musicologist, H.C. Robbins Landon, very famous musicologist whose papers we hold here at the library, Helen Hartness Flanders, who is a folk song expert, Charles Rosen, the pianist and scholar and author, Kurt Sachs, musicologist and influential organologist, don't get to say that every day, Stanley Sadie, Charles Seeger, H. Wiley Hitchcock, and many more. So we are very excited to have Professor Christoph Wolf with us today, who is the Adams University Professor Emeritus at Harvard University, where he taught music history from 1976. Professor Wolf hails from Germany, where he lived and studied as well. He studied organ and historical keyboard instruments, musicology and art history at the universities of Berlin, Erlangen, and Freiburg. His bio is in your program. If you have never heard of Professor Wolf before, you have surely seen his publications out in the world. He's been one of the foremost scholars in our field for many years. And this is kind of rock star scholar day here at the library to have Professor Wolf. And he brings insights to all of us, whether we are musicologists or whether we are folks who just enjoy listening to music and don't know what all of David's theory vocabulary means in his program notes. But Professor Wolf brings it to all of us in a really wonderful way that helps us understand the repertoire at hand. So I hope you enjoy the lecture and enjoy the concert as well at 2 o'clock in the Coolidge Auditorium next door. And thank you for being a part of this special occasion.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction. Louis C. Elson was a Harvard College graduate, and his widow also left a lecture fund at Harvard in the 1940s. So we invite distinguished scholars to Harvard. I never gave a Harvard Elson lecture, so I'm very pleased to give the talk, pre-concert talk here today. The headline, Bach meets Handel, is appropriate for today's concert program, or indeed any program that puts the music of these iconic composers of the Baroque side by side. Yet the two men, born in the same year in two neighboring central German cities, never met in person. It would be quite curious if we were to imagine a live encounter of the two composers at around age 35. Here, the tall, stately Handel, there the smaller, somewhat stocky Bach, here a world-famous opera composer from cosmopolitan London, then the world's largest metropolis of more than 1 million people, there a distinguished yet merely regionally known court Kapellmeister from the tiny principality of Anhalt-Köthen, with a capital town of little more than 2,000 inhabitants. Moreover, the musical interests and experience of the two were quite different. Even more importantly, one of the two, Bach, was eager to personally get to know the other, while Handel showed no comparable curiosity, let alone initiative. This describes the situation as it occurred in late 1719, when Bach tried to meet Handel, who was visiting his hometown in Halle, very close to Köthen. It is likely that Bach intended to deliver a princely invitation for a guest performance at the court of Köthen. It is also conceivable that Bach wanted to present Handel with samples of his works because they would not be readily available in England. But when Bach arrived in Halle, Handel had already departed after visiting his mother only briefly on his way back from Dresden to London. 10 years later, a second attempt at meeting Handel failed as well. Bach, now cantor and music director in Leipzig, but temporarily unwell in mid-June 1729 and unable to travel, sent his oldest son, Wilhelm Friedemann, with an invitation to Handel to come to Leipzig. Again, the intention was most likely to bring the composer into town for a guest performance at the Collegium Musicum, which Bach started running in the same year. He ran there a weekly concert series with mostly distinguished outside performers, out-of-town performers, including, for example, the Dresden Kapellmeister Johann Adolf Halle and his famous wife, the singer Faustina Bordoni. And other musicians were also brought to Leipzig. But unfortunately, Handel again was unable to accept the invitation, but he expressly regretted it very much. The circumstances in 1719 and 29 did not allow for a meeting of the two, but there is no evidence whatsoever that Handel disregarded Bach, let alone avoided him. And the question of what Handel would have known of Bach's music cannot be answered properly. He was certainly aware of Bach's name because, after all, there was the usual gossip and shop talk among musicians. So he must have learned early about Bach through his friends Johann Mattheson and Georg Philipp Telemann, who was closely associated with Johann Sebastian Bach. So he would definitely have known about Bach. And that is also including the famous singer Gottfried Riemschneider, who was hired as a guest performer by Bach to the court of Köthen, and Bach wrote a solo cantata for him. And then he was hired by Handel and became one of the most important bass singers at the London Opera under Handel's direction. Well, the situation is quite different the other way around. If we look at Bach, he was not only familiar with Handel's music, but he performed it quite regularly and quite frequently, especially after he had moved to Leipzig. To provide only two examples, a copy of the score of Handel's German Passion Oratorio on the famous libretto of Barthold Heinrich Borges has survived in Bach's hand from around 1740. Here is the copy of the score in Bach's hand. And in his Collegium Musicum concert series in the 1730s, Bach performed perhaps more than once the secular dramatic solo cantata Armida Abbandonata, a piece that Handel composed in Rome. And we have for this performance in Leipzig, again, a score from 1731 and also a set of parts, again, all in Bach's hand. And we may imagine Anna Magdalena, the former Köthen princely court singer, taking on the soprano part, and Johann Sebastian the violin part. Let me give you a brief example of this Handel cantata that was performed by Bach in Leipzig. Violin solo.
Dietro l'orde fugaci, de quel che tempo il lascivo soggiorno scoso avea, Armida abbandonata, il pie movea. E poi che vidi al fine che l'oro del suo crine, crudele. E porten vai,
As an example of a Handel composition performed by Bach in Leipzig. Bach certainly knew other music of Handel as well, especially keyboard works, but it is unlikely that he ever knew about Handel's later oratorios. When comparing the two composers, the narrow geographical horizon in which Bach lived and worked, and the lack of travel beyond central and northern Germany must not be overlooked. On the other hand, he tried to make up for these shortcomings by collecting and studying all kinds of music, not only by Handel, but by many contemporary composers, but also earlier composers, going all the way back to the 16th century to composers like Palestrina. So Bach had a very comprehensive knowledge of the history of music, and he was curious until his final years to get to know the music that was being written in Germany, in Italy, in France, in England, and so forth. So he was curious about all kinds of musical matters. Then there is a peculiar detail that connects the two men at the end of their lives. The irony of history created a facetious parallel. For the same English ophthalmologist and eye surgeon, the famous Sir John Taylor treated both composers as patients. Handel was slightly luckier than Bach after having undergone cataract surgery by Taylor in 1758. He survived the operation by 8 months, whereas Bach died after only 3. But the doctor himself never learned of the consequences of his operation on Bach's cataracts because he left Germany after his guest lectures in Leipzig and his demonstrations there. In his memoirs, however, which were published in 1761, Taylor recounts the names of both Bach and Handel since they were among his most famous patients, and his bragging story doesn't lack comic humor when he accounts for his vast experience. Let me quote: I have seen a great many strange animals, such as camels and so forth, and especially in Leipzig, where a famous master of music, he compares a master of music with animals like camels, had already reached his 88th year, regained his sight by my hand. It was this man with whom the famous Handel was brought up. This is, of course, not true. Bach wasn't 88 years old. He was only 65 years old, and he was not brought up with Handel. But nevertheless, the two were connected, and they both had been operated upon by the same surgeon, and they both did not survive the operation for very long. At any rate, the English oculist may have some claim in joining the two composers' names that would later form a nearly inseparable pair, standing for a bygone musical era. From this perspective, we might take a closer look at some of the major works on today's concert program. Two keyboard suites by Handel from his first published collection of 1720, and two pieces from Bach's collection of the posthumously named French suites, entered in the Klavierbüchlein, Little Clavier Book for Anna Magdalena Bach in 1722. Suites, keyboard suites in particular, were the most popular genre at the time, in the 1720s and 30s, certainly. And the composers, the two composers, demonstrate quite distinct approaches to the genre and form of the suite, as a quick comparative overview will show. You see the Handel collection and the movement sequence, which keeps varying all the time for the 8 suites, and then Bach's French suites from the Klavierbüchlein for Anna Magdalena Bach, which pursue the movement cycle of Allemande, Courante, Sarabande, and Gigue, as established in the 17th century by Froberger very strictly. So Handel takes a free approach as far as musical form is concerned, whereas Bach doesn't experiment with the form. He keeps the strict form as established in the 17th century. And if you look at the suites on today's program, you can see even more clearly how Handel only very loosely makes references to the established suite form, whereas Bach keeps the Allemande, Courante, Sarabande sequence as such, and as a finale movement uses the Gigue, and in between the Sarabande and the Gigue, he inserts so-called gallantry pieces, modern dances such as Gavotte, Bourrée, Lourd, Menuet, that really show the possibilities of modern style. So in Bach, we have clearly the structure of the traditional approach with modern additions, and Handel doesn't care so much about the established form. Indeed, he utterly disregards the form to which Bach strictly adheres. Handel's second publication of keyboard suites, which appeared in 1733, displays even greater freedom from the traditional form, while Bach, in his other two suite collections, the English suites and the 6 partitas, both of the type suites avec prelude, he leaves out the prelude in the French suites. He never leaves the Froberger model. Handel's formal freedom also shows up in his concept of fugal composition that equals his treatment of the unrestricted organization of suite movements. I show you the example of the Allegro movement in the D minor suite, where he handles the fugal exposition. I show this with the arrows, starting with the top voice, then the alto voice, then the tenor voice, and finally the bass voice. And from measure 8 on, he leaves the fugal structure. No more fugal entries. It's just improvisatory, imitative treatment until the end of the movement. So the fugue lasts 8 measures and then 39 measures free polyphonic treatment. That would not be the approach that the composer of the Well-Tempered Clavier would take. So Bach stays very strictly to the thematic structure of the fugue and spares the listener, no moment of rest where he could enjoy just free improvisatory lines. A similar approach applies to Handel's and Bach's treatment of the dance movements. The musical character of a dance movement is not defined by a single theme, as in a fugue, but rather by rhythmic melodic patterns in the leading upper voice that emphasizes the metric and choreographic makeup of any given dance. A comparison of the Allemande movements illuminates the way in which the compositional methods differ. Allemande is traditionally an early 17th century dance in slow 4/4 time with a short pickup. Handel's defining model for the Allemande is a 3/16th note pickup followed by a string of 3/16th notes that keeps repeating the motivic pattern. Ta-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. I show it, with the arrows, and you can see how that really penetrates the entire movement. Ta-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. It flows through very regularly. If we look at the Allemande in Bach's C minor suite that we hear this afternoon, you see a very different approach, the same kind of sticking to a particular motif, in this case, yam pam tim, pam pam but it doesn't come up all the time. So Bach varies it, and he also uses other possibilities to introduce the 32nd note. So it is a more complex way of approaching the dance movement, although the continuity is exactly the same as in the case of Handel, except that, Bach uses more sophisticated textures in order to create greater variety. The keyboard suites offer only a limited scope for comparative analysis, but it was the keyboard music that made both composers initially famous. In the later general reception history of their music, the emphasis shifted considerably. In the case of Handel, the oratorios played a dominant role, not only in the composer's later years, but also in respect to the reception after his lifetime. Most of these large-scale works were published in England, hence they were widely accessible throughout the UK and helped establish an almost unbroken performance tradition in England. In Bach's case, the focus remained on music for organ and harpsichord that was circulating widely in the German lands, yet primarily among professional German musicians because they were so demanding and technically difficult. Hence, his vocal works remained largely unknown beyond Leipzig and remained for a long time an insider tip for musicians who enjoyed reading but not performing the vocal scores. The differences in the dissemination and reception of Handel's and Bach's music are striking and revealing as well. In the view of the public, Handel emerged early as a national hero. Already during his lifetime, a statue was established in 1738 depicting the composer as a musical hero, as Orpheus with his lyre. You see it here. The image of the Orpheus Britannicus, initially created in 1698 for Henry Purcell, was now applied to Handel. And several decades later, the centennial of Handel's birth was celebrated with much pomp in London's St. Paul's Cathedral, albeit in 1784, 1 year early, because of an error in John Mainwaring's biography of Handel. So doesn't make too much of a difference. They celebrated Handel's anniversary with the appropriate pomp. At that time, Bach was very much an insider celebrity only, and no centennial celebration took place anywhere in Germany. Nevertheless, on the first Bach centenary in 1785, the writer Johann Martin Schubart pronounced Bach, with reference to Handel, the Orpheus of the Germans. There was, of course, no German nation at the time, only a conglomerate of various German territories. Moreover, the erection of a Bach statue had to wait until 1843, more than 100 years after the first Handel statue, when Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy dedicated a most modest monument in Leipzig. You see here the watercolor of the initial erection in 1843, and today is the statue on the right-hand side. It's still the same and slightly moved to a different place. Yet in 1786, 2 years after the Handel Centennial celebration in London, a notable event occurred in Hamburg, Germany, under the direction of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, Bach's second son. His role in the cultivation of the music by the two composers cannot be emphasized enough. The caring for his father's work is not surprising, even though this was by no means a matter of course at the time. But in the 1770s and 80s, he single-handedly established a Handel tradition in Hamburg with an impact well beyond the city and northern Germany. Arranged by the Associated Masonic Lodges of Hamburg, C.P. Bach conducted a concert to benefit a medical institute for the poor with a program that featured the Credo section from C.P. Bach's father's B minor Mass, followed by movements from Handel's Messiah, including the famous Alleluia chorus. You see the program here on the slide. So the concert started with a section of the B minor Mass, followed by sections from Messiah, and the second half includes works by Philipp Emanuel Bach himself. But this is the first public juxtaposition in a concert of the two Baroque composers, and C.P. Bach was responsible for it. He actually had a major impact on the Handel tradition, and of course also on his father's music in Germany, but he treated the two really almost equally. As I mentioned, C.P. Bach became instrumental in the dissemination of Handel's oratorios with a reach as far as Vienna. This happened primarily through connections with his longtime friend, Baron Gottfried van Swieten, director of the Imperial Library in Vienna and previously ambassador of the emperor at the Prussian court in Berlin, where the two first met. C.P. Bach later dedicated a set of 4 symphonies to van Swieten. He also supplied the music scene in Vienna with the printed editions of Handel oratorios and other vocal works, among them Acis and Galatea, Alexander's Feast, and Messiah, oratorios that were then conducted in Vienna at the van Swieten matinees by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So Mozart's various Handel arrangements for the van Swieten concerts were made possible through the services of the Hamburg Bach, whose oratorio on resurrection and ascension of Jesus was also conducted by Mozart in 1789. Moreover, numerous Viennese sources of J.S. Bach's music, including Haydn's copy of the B minor Mass, testify to the various Hamburg connections, but we do not know of any performances of a major work by Bach in Vienna in the 18th century, and that is due to the fact that the vocal scores of Bach were considered too demanding. Now, in the year 1789, which is the year in which Mozart conducted the Handel oratorios in Vienna, he also undertook a major trip to the Kingdom of Saxony in Dresden and the Prussian Kingdom in Berlin. So in April, May 1789, he traveled with his noble escort, Prince Karl Lichnowsky, to the north from Vienna. Karl Lichnowsky had studied in Germany. He had studied law at the University of Leipzig and later in Göttingen. He had been a keyboard student of the Leipzig Thomaskantor, Bach's second successor, Johann Friedrich Doles in Leipzig. And he was really the most appropriate kind of escort Mozart could wish for. And the two traveled together, first to Dresden, and then on the way to Berlin, the ultimate destination, they made a deliberate detour and a stopover in Leipzig for a few days in late April 1789. And through the connections of Count Lichnowsky, Mozart was introduced to the St. Thomas School in Leipzig, to the Thomas rector, and so he could satisfy his curiosity to get close to the musical traditions in which Bach had grown up and that Mozart had only heard about but had no personal contact with. So he showed up at the St. Thomas School. The Thomaskantor Doles performed a Bach motet for Mozart. It was the motet Singet dem Herrn ein neues Lied, Sing unto the Lord, a new song. And Mozart was quite amazed by the technical accomplishments of the St. Thomas choir and also the complexity of the 8-part score. So he specifically requested a copy of the score, which he received. The Thomas Cantor sent the score by mail to Vienna, and we still have the copy in the library in Vienna. So this is not just a rumor, but Mozart owned a copy of a Bach score. And after the performance, he is supposed to have said, now that is something from which one can learn something. So he was quite amazed when he heard the St. Thomas Choir to present this as a gesture to the visitor from Vienna. Mozart also played the organ at the St. Thomas Church, and thereby introduced his own approach to organ music to the Leipzig audience. The plan to stop by in Leipzig was improvised, but he left a major impression in Leipzig. So the Gewandhaus Orchestra, the oldest European bourgeois orchestra established in 1743, invited Mozart to return and present some of his orchestral works in Leipzig. So Mozart changed his travel plans. He went to Berlin in order to attend a performance of the abduction from the Serail, and then returned to Leipzig for a week of rehearsals with the Gewandhaus Orchestra, and he presented several piano concertos and the Jupiter Symphony. He picked the Jupiter Symphony for a good reason, because the finale movement of the Jupiter Symphony is a fugato, and to some extent, it's an homage to Bach, and it's for that reason Mozart picked this at the time when he presented the concert with the Gewandhaus. But he also composed a little piece in Vienna, which he entered into his catalog of works in May, under the date of 17 May, and he added, composed in Leipzig eine kleine Gigue, a little Gigue. Let me just give you the entry. It's a top entry in Mozart's autograph work catalog. He wrote the piece into the album of the Catholic court organist of the Pleißenburg Chapel in Leipzig, Johann Emanuel Engel, who also had acted as the impresario for the Gewandhaus concert and several Leipzig house recitals. The little piece which I'm going to play for you is an interesting kind of composition. It's a pickup from a jig from Handel's F minor suite, from the collection of which we hear two suites today at the concert. He preserves the thematic material of the Handel movement, but he peppers it with chromatic intervals, and he includes in there the reference to the name Bach, B-A-C-H, that is B flat, A, C, and B natural. So this kind of chromatic interval structure is showing up in the Handel composition. And if you look at the piece, you can see that it is in many ways transformed into a very modern style. It has Baroque patterns, but with the quirky rhythm that Mozart adds and the very special articulation and the different accents, turns it into a fascinating little modern piece that is an homage to both Bach and Handel. Let's listen to this piece. That was Anders Schiff, live performance as an encore, which he often uses this piece for because it's very effective. And if you know the Handel original, you can see how Mozart, with his eccentric articulation, turns it into something essentially new, and the BACH adds another element to it. To conclude, it seems noteworthy that in Leipzig, Mozart not only thought of Bach, but included Handel as well. For clearly, the two composers represented for Mozart two sides of the same coin, as it were. Thus, the little jig indeed epitomizes a musical meeting of Handel and Bach at the hands of Mozart. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to mention that there is an exhibition which includes a copy, original copy of the French suites in the hand of Bach's student and son-in-law, Johann Christoph Altnikol. It's the most authoritative score we have of the revised French suites, which were originally entered in the Little Klavierbuch for Anna Magdalena Bach. And there's also supposed to be a copy of Handel's opera Rinaldo, a printed copy, an early print from 1712, I believe. And the concert program today includes some arrangements from Handel's opera Rinaldo. So why don't you take a look at the exhibition case, and if there are any questions about my presentation this afternoon, feel free to ask them. We have, I think, a few minutes time.
First of all, thank you very much for the lecture and for the incredible scholarship that you have done over your career. The Bach books, the book on Mozart's late style, amazing things, and I've learned so much from them. So when you look at like something like the double fugue from the Kyrie and the Mozart Requiem, do you like see elements of Bach and Handel in that?
if you look at the major movements of the Requiem, you can see that again, Mozart is deliberately making references to both composers. The opening movement of the Requiem is based on a funeral piece by Handel for Queen Caroline. And Mozart had the score through the Van Swieten library, and he takes over essentially the substance of Handel's motivic thematic material, but he articulates it in a very different way, similar to the little jig we just listened to. And on top of this, he adds a cantus firmus, a melody of the ninth psalm tone that Mozart had seen used in Bach's Magnificat, again in the library of Baron van Swieten, and he combines in the opening movement of the Requiem, again, the two masters that served him as models in so much for his last works, including, for example, the Magic Flute. The Song of the Armed Men in the second act is, a straight style copy of J.S. Bach. So he shows his devotion to these masters of the past in quite a significant way in his later years. There are no further questions. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the concert.